Welcome back to the lecture. Let's spend a little bit of time working with an auto-scaling group. I've logged into my AWS web console and I'm currently looking at the EC2 dashboard. If I scroll down on the available menu items, I can select the auto-scaling groups feature. And in this dashboard, I'm going to click on the Create Auto Scaling Group button. And this is going to kind of take me through a wizard process where I can first create a launch configuration and then associate that launch configuration with an auto scaling group. And I'm going to create an auto scaling group with let's say 2 EC2 instances in it. And you'll see how I can create the launch configuration, define the auto scaling group, and then AWS will automatically scale up the EC2 instances for me. I will then go in and manually terminate one of those EC2 instances, and you can watch and see how AWS automatically launches a new EC2 instance to replace the one that I terminated. Let's get started. I'll click on the Create Auto Scaling Group button, and the site is telling me that there's 2 steps. I got to create a launch configuration and create an auto scaling group. Remember, the launch configuration is basically the configuration of the EC2 instance that we want the auto scaling group to manage. And then the auto scaling group configuration defines how many instances we want to launch and we want to maintain, and it would define how many sort of or what rules the auto scaling group should follow in terms of elastically adding or removing EC2 instances from the auto scaling group. I'll click the Get Started button and I'll begin creating the launch configuration. Now, creating the launch configuration is almost identical to launching an EC2 instance, except in this case, we're just creating sort of a configuration template. We're not actually launching an EC2 instance at this point. I want my EC2 instances to use the Amazon Linux 2 AMI, which is the first one. I'll go ahead and select that. T2 micro instance types, that looks fine. And I need to name my launch configuration, and I'll just call it web servers config. In terms of purchasing, I'm going to just use on-demand instances. I'm not going to apply an IAM role, and I will leave it at the default monitoring level. Of course, under advanced details, I could set the usual configuration, things like the user data. Okay, next I will add storage, and I'm going to just continue to use the default 8 GB root volume, general purpose SSD storage. That looks fine. Configure security group. It doesn't really matter what security group you choose here. I'm going to choose an existing security group, and let's see, I'm going to just use the SSH and HTTP security group, which allows both SSH and port 80 traffic in. And it doesn't matter what you choose if you're doing this hands-on segment. I'll click on Review. It lets me review the launch configuration I've created, and I'll go ahead and create the launch configuration. Now, of course, I had to select a key pair that will be used. Select my standard key pair, and it's creating the launch configuration. Now, it's not actually launching EC2 instances. Remember, it's just creating the configuration that the auto scaling group will use when it launches EC2 instances. Okay, now let's create the actual auto scaling group. We're going to give the group a name, and I'm going to call it my web server -ASG, which means auto scaling group. You can name it whatever you like. The launch configuration, it's automatically selected the launch configuration I just created, which is my web server's config launch configuration. Group size, start with how many instances? I'm going to start with 2 instances. And it's going to ask me a VPC network and a subnet. I'll use the default network. And in terms of the subnet, I'm going to select a couple subnets that I want to run, which is always a good idea. When you're creating an auto-scaling group, oftentimes you want the auto-scaling group to deploy EC2 instances across multiple subnets, which are located in separate availability zones. So I want to select 2 different subnets here, and these subnets are both in different AZs. That looks good. If I click on advanced details, then there's a couple other things I can do, like load balancing. If I wanted to, I could associate these EC2 instances with a load balancer as well. That's a little bit more of an advanced configuration, but it's actually also very, very common to do. In this case, I'm not going to bother with a load balancer, but we may use one in one of the assignments in this course. We can set up some other things like instance protection and change monitoring. We're going to leave that as it is. Next, configure the scaling policies. This is where we can decide how we want the auto-scaling group to actually scale. We can just keep the group at its current initial size. The initial size was 2, and I can just tell the auto-scaling service to maintain 2 EC2 instances at all times, or I can use some scaling policies. And when we use scaling policies, then I essentially create a set of rules. Like I could create a rule based on average CPU utilization, and when the CPU utilization is over a certain average amount, I could have it scale up the number of instances between 2 and like 5 or something. So there's all kinds of rules you can set up to scale up or scale down the number of instances in your auto-scaling group. I'm going to keep this example pretty simple and just use the first auto-scaling group configuration, which is to keep the group at its initial size. Click Next, configure notifications. If I wanted to, I could set up a notification using a service like SNS. And what this would do is it would send out a notification every time there is some sort of scaling event. Every time the service creates a new EC2 instance or terminates an instance, it can send out an event. And that could be sent out to someone's email or cell phone, or it could be sent to some other service that would do something based upon this scaling of a group of EC2 instances. I'm not going to say anything there, but I'll go to Next Tags. I'm going to add 1 tag, and this will be inherited by every instance that's launched as part of the auto-scaling group. I'm just going to create a name tag with a value of web server. I'll click on Review, so I can review my auto-scaling group, and click on Create to create my auto-scaling group. I'll hit Close. Now it's creating the auto-scaling group, and it tells us that, okay, here's my auto-scaling group. Here are the number of instances that are currently part of the scaling group. Currently there are 0, but our desired value is 2. Let's go up to the instances dashboard and see what's going on. Okay, we load our instances dashboard, and you see now that there are actually 2 EC2 instances that have been launched, and both of them have the name web server, which is the name tag that we created in our auto scaling group. And You can see that these instances are launching in parallel. The Autoscaling group service is going to launch these instances automatically for us, and they're in the initializing phase. You can see they both have public IP addresses. They are both launched in the default VPC, in a public subnet. So very cool. The Autoscaling group is automatically launching EC2 instances for us based on the launch configuration, and it's going to try to maintain 2 running instances at all times. If we go back down to Autoscaling groups, and we'll look at the configuration. Now the configuration shows that there are 2 instances running as part of our Autoscaling group. Okay. And if we go down here and look at the sort of the details of the configuration group, then we can see different activities. Like it shows us that the Autoscaling group launched a new EC2 instance. It actually launched 2 of them. We can look at things like scaling policies. We can look at the instances that are associated with the Autoscaling group. You can see which availability zones they're located in, any notifications that are sent out, and so on. Let's go and simulate a failure in one of the EC2 instances. We'll go up to our list of instances, and we will select an instance. Doesn't matter which one. We'll go to Actions, Instance State, and Terminate. That instance is now shutting down. And so what will happen is the Autoscaling group service will recognize that there are no longer 2 EC2 instances running within the Autoscaling group, and it will automatically launch a new EC2 instance to replace the one that we just manually terminated. If we go down to Autoscaling group and we look at the configuration, let me hit refresh here. It's still showing 2. Now it takes a little bit of time for the Autoscaling group to recognize that there are only 2 instances running. There's essentially kind of like a monitoring polling service in the background that's monitoring the state of these 2 services. If we go to activity history, what will happen is that here at some point it will recognize that the service has, or one of these servers has failed, and it will begin to launch a new service for us. Again, it doesn't happen immediately. It might take a minute or so for the Autoscaling service to recognize that there's only 1 instance running. If we go back to instances, you see that there's 1 instance that's terminated and the other instance is running. Okay. Now we went back to the Autoscaling group. Now you can see it says just 1 instance is running, and we desire 2. So if we go back to instances, here we go. See, now there's a new EC2 instance that is in the launching phase, and the Autoscaling service automatically recognized that there was only 1 healthy EC2 instance in the Autoscaling group. We desired 2, and so the service automatically is launching a new EC2 instance to replace the one that failed. So Autoscaling groups are really, really helpful services. I use them all the time. I mean, almost almost nearly every server configuration I create, I create it as part of an auto-scaling group. There's even, there's even a case to be made for auto-scaling groups with only one EC2 instance, which might seem kind of weird at first. Like, why would you create an auto-scaling group with only one EC2 instance? Well, maybe you have sort of a legacy application which will only run on one server. It's not a distributed application, but you want that server to be running all of the time. And you want to ensure that it stays running. What you can do is set up a single server within an auto-scaling group. And that way, if that single EC2 instance were to fail for some reason, if it fails in the middle of the night, then the auto-scaling service will automatically launch a new EC2 instance running your application, which is really helpful. So it sort of automates the service recovery process for you, which is really, really helpful. Okay, so our second server is now up and running. It's doing the initialization checks, but we can probably begin to use it. So this is really the power of auto-scaling, the ability to automatically maintain a desired set compute capacity. And it becomes even more powerful if you can elastically increase the number of instances and decrease the number of EC2 instances based on the demand of your site. That's where, now you can align the platform's capacity with the platform's demand. Now, in order to get rid of these EC2 instances, obviously I can't just go and terminate them, because as soon as I terminate them, the auto-scaling group is just going to create new ones. And so if I want to get rid of them, then I need to go into my auto-scaling group, and I need to get rid of my auto-scaling group. So I'm going to delete my auto-scaling group resource. And I then can go and delete my launch configuration once that auto-scaling group is gone. You notice that when I delete that auto-scaling group, then it's going to automatically shut down my EC2 instances as well, the EC2 instances which were part of that auto-scaling group. So it's going to clean those up. So I want to delete that auto-scaling group, and then I want to delete the launch configuration I created. So I hope you enjoyed this hands-on segment, and that you feel more comfortable now working with auto-scaling groups.